welcome to our deep dive into nationalism in Southeast Asia.
Great to be here.
You've sent over a really interesting collection of essays,
Yeah.
all about how nationalism took shape in this region.
Right.
We'll be looking at Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, how it all got started, how elections work, or don't, and how people create,
Okay.
and sometimes even fight over their national identity.
It's a rich topic, for sure. And you'll see, the path of nationalism in Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
it wasn't always straightforward.
Right from the start, I was hooked by this story about Sukarno,
Okay.
Indonesia's first president.
Yep.
He apparently compared Indonesian nationalism to Hitler's Third Reich,
Oh, yeah.
and he did it right in front of a diplomat.
Really?
What was he thinking?
It's called ventriloquism,
Okay.
and it was a very deliberate tactic Sukarno used.
Okay.
He wasn't praising Hitler, but he was trying to draw a parallel between Indonesia's struggle and other global movements.
I see.
He often invoked figures like Sun Yat-sen, Kemal Ataturk, even Gandhi, as if to say, look, we're part of something bigger here.
So he was using these globally recognized names to give Indonesia's own national identity more weight.
Exactly. He was tapping into this idea of imagined communities, the idea that nations are built on shared stories,
Right.
even if those stories are carefully chosen or even well invented.
It makes you wonder how much of any national identity is based on actual shared history versus the stories we tell ourselves about belonging. It's kind of unsettling.
It is. And that's one of the things that makes studying nationalism so fascinating,
Yeah.
especially in Southeast Asia, where things developed quite differently than in, say, Europe.
And that was another surprise for me, that nationalism in Southeast Asia emerged relatively late
Yeah.
compared to other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, for one thing, there
Mhm.
wasn't a single dominant power in the region for centuries. No equivalent to the Ottomans or the Habsburgs to create a focal point for national identity.
Right.
And then you have the incredible religious diversity, Islam, Christianity, numerous indigenous faiths.
Yeah,
It
right.
wasn't a simple us versus them situation.
But no clear unifying force,
Yeah.
politically or religiously.
Right. And when Western academics finally did start studying Southeast Asia in earnest, it was often through the lens of Cold War anxieties, especially during the Vietnam War era.
So even how we learned about Southeast Asian nationalism is colored by global power dynamics.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that knowledge is always produced within a particular context.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, these essays point out how the introduction of the census, that seemingly boring government tool, actually had a huge impact on shaping the very idea of minorities in Southeast Asia.
Hold on. How could a census do that? It's just counting people, right?
It started that way,
Okay.
mainly for tax purposes and focusing on religious categories. But as Western-style electoral systems were introduced,
Yeah.
the census was used to determine representation. By categorizing and quantifying people,
Okay.
it unintentionally created this idea of minorities as distinct groups with specific political interests.
It's like the very act of counting and classifying people created divisions where
Right.
they hadn't been so clearly defined before.
Exactly. The census, in trying to organize a complex social landscape, ended up imposing categories that had real consequences for how people saw themselves and others.
This next idea is one I'm still wrapping my head around. The essays suggest that exile, being away from your homeland,
Yeah.
is actually a crucial element in the formation of national identity. How does that work?
The historian Lord Acton argued that nationalism often grows from a sense of displacement, of longing for a homeland you're separated from. And we see this in the lives of many Southeast Asian nationalist leaders.
Okay.
Think about it. When you're away from something, you
Yeah.
often appreciate it more keenly.
Right.
You start to define what makes it unique, what makes it worth fighting for.
So those leaders, by being in exile, were forced to articulate what their nation meant to them
Right.
in a way they might not have if they'd stayed home.
That's the idea. And migration, both within and outside Southeast Asia, played a big role in this process. People moving around, encountering new cultures.
Yeah.
It all contributed to a growing sense of what made their own culture distinct.
That makes me think of long-distance nationalism, which we see a lot of today.
Yeah.
Diaspora communities deeply engaged in the politics of their home countries,
Right.
even if they've been living abroad for generations.
Absolutely. Look at the events surrounding the destruction of the Babri Mosque in India.
Okay.
A lot of the funding and activism came from Hindu nationalist groups in North America and Britain.
So even as the world gets more interconnected, those ties to one's nation, even from afar, can be incredibly powerful.
And it makes us question how national identity functions in our globalized world. It's clearly more complex than simply living within a certain geographic border.
These essays also provide a really intimate look at how Indonesian nationalism unfolded through the life of a man named Sutomo.
Okay.
Who was he?
Sutomo was a key figure in the Indonesian nationalist movement.
Okay.
His autobiography, Kenangan,
Huh.
gives us a glimpse into how his personal experiences and exposure to Western education shaped his views
Okay.
on being Javanese and being Indonesian.
I'm sensing a theme here, this idea of a generation awakening to a new national consciousness.
Yeah,
Sutomo seems to embody that.
you're right. He represents that shift from more localized traditional loyalties
Yeah.
to a more modern sense of national belonging.
Right.
And his story is interwoven with the intellectual and cultural currents of his time,
Uh-huh.
which brings us to two fascinating Javanese texts.
Yeah.
The Senthini and the Sulut Gathaloko.
I was so curious about these. They seem to represent two completely different sides of Javanese culture, almost like they're having a conversation with each other across time.
It's a great way to put it. The Senthini is this incredibly detailed, multi-volume work
Uh-huh.
that tries to capture the richness and diversity of Javanese society. It embraces all kinds of knowledge, even things that might be considered taboo, like magic or sexuality.
Wow. So it was really pushing boundaries for its time.
Absolutely. It was a celebration of Javanese culture in all its complexities.
Yeah.
In contrast, the Sulut Gathaloko takes a much more ascetic approach. It emphasizes spiritual purity and a rejection of worldly pleasures.
So almost a reaction to the kind of worldliness depicted in the Senthini.
It's possible to see it that way.
Yeah.
And both texts offer insights into how Javanese society was grappling with change
Uh-huh.
and trying to make sense of its place in the world.
Speaking of change and how societies deal with it or don't,
Yeah.
these essays also delve into Indonesia's occupation of East Timor,
Right.
a very dark period in the region's history. What can you tell us about that?
It's a complex event. A lot of contributing factors.
Yeah.
Officially, the Indonesian government under Suharto
Correct.
claimed they invaded in 1975
Uh-huh.
to prevent a communist state from forming on their border.
Okay.
But the essays suggest other motives were at play as well.
I remember reading about potential economic interests. Was that a factor?
Definitely. There was a lot of talk about oil reserves off East Timor's coast
Right.
and the possibility of Indonesia benefiting from those resources.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also important to consider the internal political situation within Indonesia itself.
Okay.
At that time, Suharto's regime very much focused on maintaining stability and projecting strength.
Right.
And the idea of an independent East Timor,
Uh-huh.
potentially aligning with communist powers,
Yeah.
was seen as a threat to that stability.
The essays are quite critical of ASEAN,
Yes.
Association of Southeast Asian Nations, for their lack of action during this crisis.
Yes, and for good reason. ASEAN's policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of member states meant they were basically powerless to intervene, even in the face of clear human rights abuses. It's a stark example of how regional solidarity can sometimes take a backseat to national interests, especially when powerful states are involved.
It's a sobering reminder that these international organizations, while well-intentioned, don't always have the teeth to enforce their principles when it really matters.
Exactly. And that tension between national interests and broader regional or global concerns is something that runs throughout the history of Southeast Asia.
Okay.
It's important to keep in mind as we shift our focus to Thailand now. The essays bring up this intriguing link between political violence and the rise of a new middle class in Thailand.
I was struck by how the essays framed that.
Okay.
It wasn't just random violence, but seemed tied to specific economic shifts.
Right. The Vietnam War era brought a huge economic boom to Thailand. creating a new class of entrepreneurs and professionals.
Yeah.
A new bourgeoisie, essentially.
Okay.
And as this group gained wealth and influence,
Right.
they began to challenge the existing power structures, leading to clashes, sometimes quite violent, with the old elite.
That's where the story about the Thai film New Puen comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The one that contrasts a state-sponsored assassin with one working for private enterprise.
New Puen captures that shifting landscape of power and violence in Thai society. It raises questions about how the lines between state authority and private interests can blur, especially in times of rapid economic and social change.
It's a reminder that who holds the power and how they use it is constantly in flux. I wonder if there are any parallels to that in the Philippines, which is where we're headed next.
Absolutely. The Philippines has its own unique set of challenges when it comes to power and democracy. The essays focus on something called cacique democracy. Basically, a system where powerful landowning families control the political landscape.
It's amazing how that system has endured for so long, even after the Philippines gained independence.
It speaks to how deeply entrenched those power structures are. And what's particularly striking is how American colonialism, despite its rhetoric of promoting democracy, actually reinforced this cacique system. Instead of dismantling the old elite, they often co-opted them, incorporating them into the new political order.
So even though the Philippines transitioned to a supposedly democratic system, the real power remained in the hands of these families.
In many ways, yes. The essays use the example of Corazon Aquino and her family to illustrate this point. Aquino herself came from one of the most powerful cacique families, and her husband, Benigno Aquino Jr., was also from a prominent political dynasty. Even after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, which Aquino helped to bring about, the influence of these families persisted.
It makes you wonder how much can truly change even when there's a change in leadership.
It's a question that resonates across Southeast Asia and indeed in many parts of the world. Power structures tend to be very resilient. And changing them requires more than just replacing one leader with another. It requires addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that allow these structures to thrive.
Speaking of enduring power, the essays also discuss José Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. This novel is considered a foundational text for Filipino nationalism. But there's a fascinating twist to the story, isn't there?
There is. The essays point out that Leonma Guerrero's widely read English translation of Noli Me Tangere actually distorted Rizal's original message. Guerrero downplayed the novel's sharp critique of the Catholic Church and its role in Philippine society. And he softened some of the social commentary that made the novel so powerful.
So the translation, in a way, sanitized the original work.
Exactly. It's an interesting example of how a text's meaning can shift depending on who's translating it and for what audience. In this case, Guerrero's translation reflected the changing political context of the Philippines in the 20th century. The novel, originally a searing indictment of Spanish colonialism, was being adapted to fit a more official, state-sanctioned version of Filipino nationalism.
It highlights the power of translation, doesn't it? It's not just a neutral act of converting words, but can involve shaping the interpretation of an entire work.
It's incredibly powerful, and it makes us think critically about how we encounter texts, especially those from other cultures. Whose voice are we hearing? Whose perspective is being privileged? Whose story is being told? And whose story is being silenced?
Wow, that's a lot to consider. And it makes me wonder, are there other examples of how literature has shaped or been shaped by national identity in Southeast Asia?
Of course. Literature is a powerful tool for exploring and expressing ideas about nationhood, belonging, and cultural identity. The essays draw an interesting comparison between the development of national novels in Southeast Asia and Latin America.
I remember reading about that. It seemed like there were some key differences in how those national novels emerged in each region.
That's right. In Latin America, national novels often emerged after independence, playing a key role in the process of nation building. They helped to create a shared sense of identity and purpose for newly independent nations.
So the novels were actively shaping national consciousness in those cases.
Exactly. They provided a narrative framework for understanding the nation's history, its struggles, its triumphs, and its aspirations. In contrast, the relationship between novels and nationalism in Southeast Asia is more complex.
It seems like there's no single straightforward formula for how literature and nationalism interact.
It depends on the specific historical context, the political climate, the cultural landscape. It's fascinating to see how writers in Southeast Asia have used literature to grapple with issues of colonialism, identity, and social change.
We've been talking a lot about how external forces like colonialism have shaped the region. But it's also important to look at how internal factors have played a role. The essays introduce us to Pramoedya Anantatur, one of Indonesia's most famous authors.
Pramoedya, often called Pram, was an incredibly important voice in Indonesian literature. His work often challenged the official narratives promoted by the government, particularly during the Suharto regime.
I know he wrote a powerful tetralogy based on the life of Tirto de Suryo, an early Indonesian nationalist. What can you tell us about that?
The tetralogy is a masterpiece of historical fiction. It offers a critical perspective on Dutch colonialism, and it delves into the complex social dynamics of early 20th century Indonesia. Through the story of Tirto de Suryo, a pioneering journalist and activist, Pram explores themes of resistance, identity, and the search for justice.
But his work was banned by the Suharto regime, right?
Yes, for many years. Pram's writing was seen as a threat to the regime's authority. He was imprisoned for over a decade, and his books were censored. But despite the repression, his work continued to circulate underground, inspiring generations of Indonesians with its unflinching honesty and its powerful message of hope.
It's amazing how a work of fiction can be so powerful that it's perceived as dangerous by those in power. It speaks to the ability of art to challenge dominant narratives and offer alternative perspectives.
Absolutely. And Pram's story highlights the important role that writers and artists can play in shaping public discourse and challenging injustice.
The essays bring up a really interesting concept. After communism. It seems like this period, after the decline of communist movements, played out very differently in Thailand and Peru.
You're right. There's no one-size-fits-all narrative for how societies deal with the legacy of communism. In Thailand, the decline of the Communist Party led to a period of intellectual ferment and reassessment. People began to re-examine their history, to question the old narratives, and to explore new ideas.
So it was a time of questioning and critical thinking.
Exactly. There was a sense of possibility, a sense that things could be different. In contrast, the essays point to Mario Vargas Llosa's novel El Hablador as a way to understand the experience of after communism in Peru.
I'm not familiar with that one. What's it about?
El Hablador explores the clash between modernity and indigenous cultures in Peru. It raises questions about the fate of marginalized communities in the face of national progress and globalization. It's a nuanced and thought-provoking work that challenges easy answers and simplistic narratives.
So it's less about celebrating the fall of communism and more about grappling with the complexities of what comes after.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that historical transitions are rarely clean-cut or straightforward. They often bring new challenges and raise new questions about identity, belonging, and social justice.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the early stirrings of nationalism to its contemporary expressions. But there's one more topic I want to touch on before we wrap up. The essays mention the Asian crisis and Suharto's prediction that Southeast Asia would never again experience the same level of economic growth it had enjoyed in the preceding decades. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, and it reflects a sense of disillusionment with the Asian miracle that had dominated the region for so long. Up until that point, many Southeast Asian nations had experienced rapid economic growth, fueled by a combination of factors, including Cold War geopolitics, Japanese investment, and the availability of cheap labor. But by the late 1990s, those conditions were changing.
What were some of the key changes that led to this shift?
So many things, really. You had the end of the Cold War, which meant Southeast Asian nations could no longer rely on the same level of support from the United States. Then you have the rise of China as a major economic power, creating new competition.
The playing field was changing dramatically.
Exactly.
And the Asian crisis of 1997-98 exposed the vulnerabilities of these export-oriented, growth-driven economies. Suddenly, the model that had brought so much prosperity was being questioned. And Suharto's prediction, bleak as it was, came right in the midst of that crisis. It makes you wonder, what did he see that made him so pessimistic about the future?
I think he recognized that the conditions that had created the Asian miracle were unique and unlikely to be replicated. The Cold War context, the influx of Japanese capital, the ready supply of cheap laborers, those factors weren't going to last forever. And he might have been sensing that Southeast Asian nations would need to find new, more sustainable models for growth, models that took into account social equity and environmental sustainability.
It's a reminder that even periods of rapid growth and apparent stability can be fragile, built on shifting sands.
So where does all of this leave us? We've been on this incredible journey through the history of nationalism in Southeast Asia. And honestly, my head is spinning a bit. What are some of the key takeaways you think are most important for our listener?
I think the biggest takeaway is just how complex and dynamic nationalism is. It's not a static ideology, but a constantly evolving force shaped by internal and external pressures, adapting to changing circumstances. We've seen how it's been influenced by colonialism, religion, globalization, economic transformations, and even seemingly mundane things like censuses.
It's almost like nationalism is this chameleon, changing colors depending on the environment it's in.
That's a great analogy.
And it's crucial to remember that context.
When we look at how Sukarno used ventriloquism to legitimize Indonesian nationalism, or how exile shaped the thinking of so many leaders, or how literature, from Noli Me Tangere to Pram's banned novels, has both reflected and challenged national narratives, we're seeing how fluid and adaptable this force can be.
Exactly.
And what about the future of nationalism in Southeast Asia? Given all the historical baggage and the current challenges, what do you see on the horizon?
That's the million-dollar question. The essays don't give us a crystal ball, but they do offer some food for thought. They highlight the enduring power of national identity, even in an increasingly interconnected world. They show how nationalism can be both a source of unity and a source of division. And they point to the need for new models of development models that address social inequality and promote sustainability. Ultimately, the future of nationalism in Southeast Asia will depend on the choices that people make, both individually and collectively.
And those choices will be shaped by the stories we tell ourselves. About who we are as nations, about our shared history and our imagined futures. What we've explored today suggests those stories are always being written, rewritten, and contested.
Precisely. And engaging with those stories critically, understanding the power they hold, and recognizing the multiplicity of voices within them. That's crucial for navigating the complexities of nationalism, not just in Southeast Asia, but anywhere in the world.
Well said. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on Southeast Asia.
Good.
And honestly, on the very idea of what it means to belong to a nation. I want to thank our listener for sharing these fascinating essays with us. It's been quite a deep dive.
It has. And I hope it encourages everyone to keep exploring,
Yeah.
to keep questioning, and to keep seeking out diverse perspectives on this complex and ever-evolving topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone.